Welcome you to this book launch of an edited volume. It's purchased up here. It's up here called The EU and Africa, the European Union and Africa, from Eurafrique to Afro-Europa. And we have with us this afternoon three of the contributors to this volume. The Executive Director of the Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, Adekeye Adebajo, Mr. Rob DeVos, who at the time was the permanent representative of Netherlands, the ambassador of the Netherlands to South Africa, currently the Consul General of the Netherlands here in New York City, and Mr. Professor Peter Schraeder from Loyola University, who participated in several other conferences that we held together, Ade and myself, and the various teams from IPA at the time and CCR, and conferences in Kampala and in Tanzania, in Dar es Salaam. So this is a very special book on something you may or may not know a great deal about, which is the relationship between the European Union and the African Union. And of course, we're sitting here in New York City, where a lot of the focus is on the relationship between the United Nations and the African Union. So this afternoon provides us an opportunity to get a perspective on another very important relationship for Africa, that with the European Union. So each of our speakers here will speak for 10 to 12 minutes, and then we will have an opportunity for a discussion, and I'll take sort of 2 or 3 questions at a time and then revert back to the panel. So I'm going to start, again, a warm welcome. The book, by the way, is on sale. I should promote this book on behalf of all of those who created it, all of whom are up here, and many others. So including James Jonah, our good friend from the United Nations, a former Undersecretary General, and another major contributor to this and other CCR volumes. So the book is on sale outside, and I hope at least some of you will consider and actually go ahead and purchase it. So we're going to start with Ade, who was, as I said, sort of the conceptualizer of this volume, and then we'll hear from Ambassador, from Mr. DeVos and Peter Schraeder. Ade, the floor is yours.
Thank you, John, and good afternoon, everybody. It's really glad to be here again, back home, as it were, since this was my home for 5 years, and it's good to see so many familiar faces also. And I'd like to acknowledge the Nigerian permanent representative, Joy Ogu, whom I've known since my time in Nigeria. She's tried to make me a bit more diplomatic, but it hasn't worked so far. I'd also like to just acknowledge my co-panelists before I launch into this. John and I worked very closely together here in building the Africa program. Rob effectively helped to support the Africa program while I was in South Africa, and the Dutch continue to be one of our big supporters. So he's a real friend of the book, along with the Danes, the Swedes, the Norwegians, and the Finns. And Peter Schraeder, I haven't seen in maybe 20 years, is one of the major and most respected Africanists in the US. I'm trying to butter him up so he doesn't savage the book too harshly. Even though the European Union has been Africa's largest trading partner over the last 5 decades, this is an area in which few African institutions have produced academically rigorous and policy-relevant knowledge. In fact, there haven't been really that many books, despite the kind of bountiful harvest of books on the EU's specific relationship with Africa. This volume seeks to correct this anomaly and to contribute to a better understanding of the historically difficult relationship between Africa and the EU in the areas of history, politics, economics, security, migration, and identity The Center for Conflict Resolution in Cape Town, where I work, organized 2 research and policy seminars in 2007 and 2008. And this unique 22-chapter book basically emerges from these seminars and contains rich insights from both African and European scholars and practitioners, as well as an Asian and an American scholar. The book is divided into 6 parts. The first part, an introductory chapter by my co-editor, Kaye Whiteman, basically looks at the rise and fall of what we call Eurafrique, from the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885 to the Tripoli EU-Africa Summit in 2010. My chapter compares and contrasts both the AU and the EU, and I'll say a bit more about it when I summarize it later on. The second part of the book examines the political, economic, and strategic dimensions of this relationship. We focus on regional integration by Adebajo, often referred to as the father of African integration, contributed a chapter. We then have a chapter on European aid to Africa by Rob de Vos, which he can talk more about. We look at the EU's strategic relationship with South Africa, the Maghreb, the Mediterranean, and Asia in other chapters in the book. The third part then focuses on trade, investment, and development issues, looking at Africa as the last investment frontier, looking at the very thorny issues around the economic partnership agreements between Africa and Europe, doing a critique of the common agricultural policy, while the fourth part assesses security and governance issues, and we have case studies on EU interventions in the Great Lakes and Chad Central African Republic. The fifth part of the book examines case histories of the role of key European actors in Africa, France, Britain, Portugal, and the Nordics within the context of the EU. The volume then concludes by examining important issues of migration and identity, with a particularly eloquent chapter by Ali Mazrui on the Black Atlantic, from Othello to Obama, which employs the European literary canon of Shakespeare and Pushkin to make diasporic connections between Africa, Europe, and the US. The study notes that Africa and Europe still have not fully escaped the burdens of history, as the trenchant critique of French policy in Africa by Douglas Yates, an American scholar, demonstrates, and examines the feasibility of defining and implementing an Afro-Europa, a new relationship of genuine equality, partnership, and mutual self-interest between both continents, which sheds the baggage of the past. So I'll very quickly go through my own chapter in the book, which is titled Paradise Lost and Found. In a sense, humankind has been attempting to come together to learn to speak a common language ever since God dismantled the Tower of Babel. The AU, which celebrated its 10th anniversary last year, and the EU, which celebrated its 55th, can be seen as efforts to create perfect unions, modern Towers of Babel, by bringing together scattered African and European diasporas. The African Union is currently attempting to unite a continent of 800 million people from the Cape to Cairo, while the European Union is striving to bring together 500 million people from Sofia to Stockholm. The AU's predecessor, the Organization of African Unity, emerged in 1963 to liberate the continent from colonial rule. The European Economic Community, forerunner of the EU, emerged in 1957 as an effort to prevent another war between Germany and France. So while Pan-Africanism was an ideology of liberation, Pan-Europeanism was an ideology of conflict prevention. This is, however, a tale of a rich man's club and a poor man's club. While the EU accounts for about 30% of the world's economy, Africa accounts for less than 2% of world trade. Both the AU and EU have been accused of being elite-driven bodies that suffer from a democratic deficit in which their citizens have not been properly consulted. But while the EU represents a carefully calibrated balance between supranationalism and sovereignty, decision-making within the EU remains dominated by its heads of state. Unlike the EU, where power is shared between its institutions, the AU is a top-down, heads of state-driven body. The AU Commission Secretariat is headed by a chair, currently its first female head, and first female head of either the OAU or the AU, South Africa's Dlamini Zuma, and 9 commissioners. Its main task is to implement the decisions of AU organs. In practice, however, the Commission has struggled to establish its independence. An AU audit report of December 2007 was scathing about the administrative and management failings of the Alpha Conare Commission between 2003 and 2008. There was a lack of implementation of programs, with only 50% of approved tasks implemented in 2006, and most directorates were underspending by 70 to 90%. The Brussels-based EU Commission, in stark contrast, is the guardian of the treaties and initiates most of the body's legislation, issuing about 500 directives and decisions annually. The Commission is also the only international body of its kind with the supranational powers that it has. If EU governments refuse to abide by Commission decisions, Brussels can take them to the European Court of Justice and seek a judgment. The Commission is usually astute enough, however, not to get into direct confrontation with member governments. The EU Commission also has a staff of about 33,000 compared to the AU Commission's paltry 669 personnel. I'm sure there are many UN agencies that are bigger than the AU. While the AU budget of $260 million is irregularly paid by its member states, the EU budget of 150 billion euros is always paid by its members. Unlike AU staff, the EU Commission staff are also paid at the top level of international organizations like the UN. They're multilingual and often believe strongly in the ideals of the organizations. Though the AU does have some impressive staff, it also has many deadwood who should be swept away and burnt. Both the AU and the EU have their own national and linguistic mafias. Neither organization bases promotion strictly on a meritocratic system, but often on the power of influential networks and godfathers. One area in which the AU and the EU are similar, however, is their reputation as a bésodrome, a place of much fun, with about half of the Eurocrats in Brussels being divorced by some surveys in early 1990s. Addis Ababa, the seat of the AU with the lure of Ethiopian women of legendary beauty and its renowned social boredom, also produces its own share of broken marriages. Both organizations have suffered from mismanagement and corruption. In fact, the Jacques Santer Commission, as some of you will remember in the EU, had to be basically sacked in 1999. The EU may be even more nepotistically nationalistic than the AU, as the cabinet of EU commissioners are chosen almost largely on national lines. EU commissioners also tend to show less independence of their national governments than AU commissioners. Half of the AU commissioners are women, in contrast to the EU's 1/3. So while the EU Commission has delegations in over 120 countries and established a foreign service in 2011, the AU has offices in New York, Washington, D.C., and Brussels. European institutions, in concluding, like the Commission, the Council, the Parliament, and the Court of Justice, evolved gradually over time and acquired increasing powers as they gained credibility and effectiveness. The AU's institutions, in contrast, do not appear to be evolving organically, and the appearance of a Pan-African Parliament, even as parliaments aren't functioning internally, or some countries don't really have any effective ones, and African human rights courts seem to be an unsynchronized process of a miraculous Big Bang. The Afro has not followed the Euro as a pan-continental currency. And it must also be conceded, though, that African integration was derailed by external Cold War rivalries and proxy wars, which prevented some of the regional integration schemes from taking off. So while European integration, as I've said before, is often compared to a bicycle where the members have to keep pedaling in order to avoid falling off the contraption, African integration, in stark contrast, has often resembled the rickety ride on the back of a mammy wagon with failing lights and potholed roads, and the memorable sign, "No condition is permanent," inscribed on the vehicle. Africa, the original birthplace of the biblical Garden of Eden, represents a tragic case of paradise lost, while Europe, despite its current economic travails, could represent a case of paradise found. Thanks.
Well, Ade, thank you very much. For those of you, I hope you caught all of that, but because there was a lot there. But if you did not, you can get the book, and I've read some of this, and it's all in there. So I really commend that to you again. I'd like to also extend my warm welcome to the permanent representative of Nigeria, and it's wonderful to have you join us as well. So our next speaker will be Mr. De Vos, the Consul General of the Netherlands and the former ambassador of the Netherlands to South Africa.
Thank you very much. But I had been a policy advisor, working for 5 years with a minister in the Netherlands. Before that, working in African countries like Mali, Tanzania, Kenya, and Yemen, a country on the borderline between the Middle East and Africa. And I wanted to go a little bit deeper. So what I'm going to tell you in the coming 10 minutes is also a personal reflection. It's not the point of view of my ministry, of my government. It's what I think I learned in the last 35 years working mostly in international cooperation. So what did I learn? Is there a need and a scope for improvement? I have 6 lessons prepared for you. And because these lessons were drawn 5 years ago, I also looked the last few days whether these lessons are still valid and something has changed. And of course, this picture can only be very sketchy, can be very broad, and it's very much a personal one. Lesson 1, Europe and Africa. Stop fooling ourselves with documents full of grand scenarios, strategic partnerships, and often a lack of concrete deliverables. And when we then finally sit together and talk, because in the case of APAS, EPAS, African countries, prepare yourself better. In a number of cases, African countries and regional organizations were surprised when the deadline was approaching in the case of APAS. And Europe accepted that Africa is not a monolithic continent. And of course, then there were cases of false solidarity. For years, we have not talked to each other because the agenda was hijacked by the issue of Zimbabwe and by President Mugabe. Lesson 2, we should analyze progress in Africa and Europe and in our relationship based on facts and not on emotions. There's always what I would call the doom and gloom side, who always will argue that Africa is a basket case. And there's the side which is always overly optimistic. Booming continent, high growth figures, rapid urbanization, young population. Furthermore, and I remember we discussed it extensively in Cape Town, Stellenbosch, in my opinion, there's no African economic way to reach a balanced socioeconomic growth path. Macroeconomic policy mix for Africa is more or less the same as for the rest of the world. Of course, there will be smaller differences on country level in the policy mix. And of course, we have to look for what is now called the binding constraints. Then, A fundamental third lesson, yardstick to measure effectiveness of our policies, is the level of coherence. Policies should reinforce each other. It's not only about aid, it's also about trade, it's about migration, it's about our approach to development, defense, and diplomacy. In the so-called Paris Agenda, to which donors coordinate and even pool resources, and recipient countries and donors work out mutual accountability mechanism, we have an important building block for this coherence. But here, 5 years ago, I said the picture is a mixed one. And although Europe is being praised, for instance, by the Center for Global Development on its coherence, I had the feeling then that the Paris Agenda was already running out of steam. Why? It's not very attractive for politicians with a time horizon of 4 years. And I believe that the African countries were never believers. One aspect that we have, and I felt an omission in my 35 years, in our relationship between the donor and the recipient, is the psychology of aid. Oh yes, we do change names. Aid becomes cooperation. We play the game of semantics. But in the end, the relationship, and it's been stressed by Ada, stays fundamentally unbalanced. And we, from our side in Europe, are surprised that the gratitude is not larger. Fifth lesson, interventions within the field of development cooperation are probably the most evaluated in the world. Still, the conclusion often is impact could not be measured. Most of the time, there's a simple reason. Baseline surveys to determine our starting point are not properly made. We do not have control groups or control areas. And then there's this discussion on the micro paradox. Effective results on the ground are not translated into macroeconomic figures, growth. So in the end, the whole relevance of aid became more and more questioned. 6 lessons. Most of the socioeconomic analytical work is done outside the continent, outside Africa. So there's a big need of independent, homegrown African capacity to analyze socioeconomic developments. Now, where are we 5 years later? And again, this can be only a sketchy and selective picture. Well, the image of the two continents have changed a bit. Africa has become more popular, and Europe, since 2008, well, we do have some challenges. And as you can see, I avoid the word crisis. In security matters, however, Europe has been very active. Côte d'Ivoire, Libya, Mali, and combating piracy near Somalia. Luckily, I have the impression we have lost our interest in big conferences, grand scenarios, speeches which often started with Adam and Eve and leading us to nowhere. No, we don't have time for that. There's so much at stake at the moment, and more important things to do. So, first point of positive development. What about analytical work? Is it still a question of the empty, half-empty glass? The doom and gloom brigade? And the other side, everything is rosy from the African front? No, I do see the last few years some creative, more innovative research, especially from the African Development Bank, which really adds value to the work that's being done in Washington, New York, and Addis Ababa. And a fine example is their report, 50 Years' Time, The Road Towards Inclusive Growth, from September 2011. And then there's McKinsey & Company. They discovered the power of the African consumer in their report, The Rise of the African Consumer, from 2012. 3 conclusions. Africans are exceptionally optimistic about their economic future. Secondly, internet use is far greater than anticipated, And thirdly, African consumers demand quality products and are brand conscious. Furthermore, I would like to draw your attention to the work done by the United Nations University and wider, the World Institute for Development Economic Research in Helsinki, which finally found that there is a relationship between growth and aid. A positive one, not spectacular, but aid has never been very spectacular compared to investments and compared to transfers. So we can bury the macro-micro paradox. And did we find new elements for a new alternative model or theory for the African economy? I still don't believe so. Coherence. The coherence of European intervention policies is a key element of the effectiveness of the European interventions and so the success of our Europe-African relationship. Europe has a lot in its pocket, a lot of the important building blocks for this coherence. The aid agenda, set in Paris by OECD, is embraced. The concept of 3D, so we combine development, defense, and diplomacy. It's a concept now more than 10 years old. Brussels coordinates trade policy is not any longer a matter for the individual member states. And migration is not an exclusive matter for the member states. And Europe has started with its own diplomatic service, which is really gaining strength rapidly, and I could see it in Africa. Concerning this coherence of aid instrument, Europe still receives the highest marks from independent assessors. But the overall picture is not a positive one on coherence. The Paris agenda has lost more momentum, and I don't believe it will come back on track. The 3D concept has only selectively been used, and often is it too much to handle for the EU and the member states. And African solutions for African problems? A clever way to excuse ourselves, Europeans? And migration. There was no real courage from our side to start experiments with structural, temporary skill gap alleviations. Programs are on the table. Europe, driven from Brussels, lacks a clear strategy vis-à-vis Africa. It copies member states on a technical level. Should be recognized, it's often performing better than the member state, but it has no image, so it's taken for granted in Africa. If I'm not mistaken, there's still one book, Lesson 3, written on the psychology of aid. But what do we see in the world of donors? A wave of populism in the Western world has contributed to a redesigned aid policy. Fewer financial means, but also a desire to reach mutual benefits. Ironically, maybe, this rediscovery of self-interest by Europe could be positive vis-à-vis the issue of psychology of aid. And on the work, fifth lesson, on the work of sophisticated evaluation techniques, I think a lot has been done, often financed by the Melinda and Bill Gates Foundation. Interest by donors of homegrown African socioeconomic research capacity, unfortunately, is not growing. Western donors do see this more and more as alien to their program portfolio. I conclude. In the present situation of world affairs, it's my feeling, and it's a feeling, it's up to Europe to take the partnership with Africa to a higher level. There are a number of important drivers and stimulants for aiming at this higher level. First one, Europe cannot afford an unstable Maghreb, Sahel region, which may bring unpleasant surprises to our own continent. Secondly, developing middle class in Africa provides a growing market for European quality products. Thirdly, a migration education model with Africa may serve as a structural, widely accepted by our population solution to the expected labor shortage in Europe due to the aging of our population. For a balanced, inclusive socioeconomic development, Africa simply has to invest more in physical infrastructure, human capital, technology, and institution building. For these last three areas, Europe has by far the greatest comparative advantages compared to the BRIC countries. The Brussels bureaucracy has the advantage of a longer time horizon than the European politicians on a national level. It's high time they take the lead to develop a realistic, medium-term strategy with the above-mentioned elements, and maybe even more. And please, this time, with the participation of African countries and institutions right from the start. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. De Vos. This was really a very thoughtful and reflective presentation you have just made, neither wildly optimistic or euphoric, but also not sort of this pessimism that used to prevail in certain policy debates in the United States, if not in Europe. So I thought many of your ideas were really important, and I hope one way or another we can share these through our webpage, but this was really excellent. So our third speaker, our discussant, is Professor Peter Schraeder. Peter, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Let me start out by thanking John Hirsch and the International Peace Institute for inviting me to take part. John and I both share a special love for the island of Zanzibar, which we were talking about earlier, especially because in my own case, this is the 20th anniversary of my marriage, and I actually got married on the island of Zanzibar. And my wife is here, but she's not at the panel. She's wandering around New York somewhere. I'd also like to thank my co-panelists, Ambassador De Vos, and of course Ade, whose book we're here to talk about today. And I especially would like to thank each and every one of you for taking the time out of your busy schedules to hear what we have to say today. Let me start out by saying that it truly was a pleasure to read Ade's book, as well as the two reports which preceded it, all of which were published by the Center for Conflict Resolution in South Africa and Columbia University Press. As Ade noted, I mean, this provides the first comprehensive overview of EU-European-African relations from a historical, cultural, military, all contexts. And there's a lot of adjectives that I would use to describe this book. I mean, in one sense, it's a pioneering work. In another sense, it's an exhaustive survey, 5 or 6 sections. But I think most importantly, I would call it a seminal work. And what I mean by a seminal work is one that provides a very unique interpretation of a subject matter and also has extremely rigorous scholarship. So it's a pleasure to be here. And what I'd like to do is set out 4 sets of observations about the book. And the first observation I would entitle Neocolonialism and the Ghosts of Berlin, ? Which essentially refers back to the Berlin Conference of 1884. And it deals with the main subheading of Ade's book, which you have right in front of you, and again, buy it, it's a great book. The subheading is From Eurafrique to Afro-Europa. And as Ade notes in the book, the concept of Eurafrique, like Francafrique, carries a very negative neocolonial understanding of the African continent and especially Europe's relationship with the continent. And the purpose of their book, if I read directly from their introduction, Ade's introduction, the purpose of this book is thus in part to examine how far attitudes have changed in this relationship and whether a new, more balanced concept, which we choose to baptize Afro-Europa, that is, an equal partnership of mutual interests without suggestion of a special relationship of more significance than others, can now become predominant. So the theme is Afro-Europa and the idea of growing equality. But when I was reading the book, what I was struck by is the question of whether or not there truly has been growing equality in this relationship, and the concept of neocolonialism, which is sometimes implicitly or explicitly, it shows up in the book. And as you all know, the concept of neocolonialism, I mean, essentially it argues that the granting of legal independence in the 1950s really did very little to change the continuing web of economic, political, cultural, military ties that continues to bind Africa to Europe today. And I reflected on this as I was reading the book, because we're coming up on a very important anniversary in 2018, and it's connected to the Conference of Berlin, as Ade mentioned, and that is in 2018, that will be the 67th year of African independence if we count forward from 1951, which is the year of independence for Libya. So 67 years. What's fascinating, though, is that if you go back 67 years earlier, the Conference of Berlin, 1884 to 1951, is also 67 years. So in a few years, we're going to be approaching the point where the core period of direct European colonialism will now be superseded by the contemporary independence era. And I guess the question that I have for Ade, and hopefully he can talk about a little this during the question and answer period, is to what degree, as we move further away from that period of direct colonial rule, and as we approach this anniversary, to what degree are we actually seeing enhanced levels of equality and moving away from concepts of neocolonialism? And equally, what would his African colleagues say about this? I mean, to quote Ambassador DeVos's presentation, is the glass half empty or is it half full? Is it increasingly becoming so? Is it decreasingly becoming so? So that's my first observation. A second observation I would entitle Follow the Leader. All right, so Follow the Leader, it's a game that my kids love to play. They run around the house. I've got a 14-year-old, a 10-year-old, and a 7-year-old. And for them, Follow the Leader is a great thing, because the younger kids follow the older kid. They follow the best practices of that child. But what I find interesting in reading the volume and reflecting on European involvement in Africa, especially EU involvement, is that EU foreign policy, for better or for worse, oftentimes follows the leadership of the European country that happens to be most involved in an African country at a particular point in time. And I think that this is especially the case when we talk about the role of France in its former colonies. And I think this concept was set out very nicely by Kaye Whiteman in chapter 1 of the volume, in which he very clearly demonstrates how the EU's willingness to become increasingly militarily involved on the African continent in many ways has been encouraged by France, as France has tried to justify its own continued military presence, as well as Europeanize what it is doing militarily. And probably one of the best recent examples of this is the fact that beginning in 2005, nearly €250 million, so 250 million euros, have been diverted from the European Development Fund to a security project that many of you know in this room, which is the African Peace Facility. And as Whiteman notes in the introduction, this is a very interesting trend, because this is something that probably would have been unthinkable 10 years ago, 15 years ago. But the key point that I want to make and focus on here is that, especially when we look at French intervention and French military intervention as simply one case, I mean, this has put the EU in the position of following the leader, or in essence, putting pressure on the EU to follow French foreign policy in Africa. And again, I don't say this to say that it's a good or bad thing, but simply a reflection of reality. And a couple of the case studies, the recent case studies that we could look at and discuss the degree to which this is a beneficial thing, would be the NATO-led intervention in Libya in 2011, and of course, the most recent military intervention in Mali that is ongoing. All right, so that would be my second point. A third observation that's much more near and dear to my heart because of my recent work in North Africa. I spent a lot of time in Tunisia, Egypt, Algeria. That third observation, or that third theme, I would entitle, how can the European Union ensure that the Arab Spring becomes an Arab summer and not an Arab winter? And more specifically, what tools should constitute part of the EU's global arsenal of democracy in trying to promote an Arab Spring or summer in North Africa? And this is especially interesting because when you read Ade's book, you think about the irony of the fact that the fourth EU-Africa summit was held in Cairo, Egypt in 2010, which was just 1 year prior to when Mohamed Bouazizi, a fruit vendor in Tunisia, lit himself on fire in protest against a very authoritarian regime. And in so doing, I mean, he literally touched off protests in Tunisia that led to the downfall of a very dictatorial government in Tunisia, dictatorships in Libya, Egypt, and pro-democracy trends and desires for political change throughout the Middle East and North Africa. Now, these events, the events of the Arab Spring, are mentioned in Ade's book, but understandably, they're not looked at in great detail because the completion of the chapters and the publication of the book itself coincided with the emergence of the Arab Spring. And that's why it's interesting for me to hopefully get Ade to reflect a little bit on this, because the debate over intervention in North Africa is very critical to understanding the EU's relationship with Africa as a whole. It's obviously the EU's backyard, and it's a principal part of the European neighborhood policy. And in discussing this, I mean, we can think about at least 7 different tools of intervention that the EU and the other northern industrialized powers, including the United States, have used to try to promote political change and especially democratization. And I could just set those out from the least coercive to the most coercive. So I set it out 7 different tools. So that includes number 1, the pursuit of classic diplomacy. Number 2, the provision of aid. Number 3, the attachment of political conditionalities. Number 4, the adoption of economic sanctions. Number 5, covert intervention. Number 6, paramilitary intervention. And then finally, the most coercive tool of all, direct military intervention. Now, what's interesting here is that the least coercive side of the interventionist spectrum, meaning foreign aid and the use of diplomacy, as Ambassador DeVos set out in his presentation, I mean, this is the most common form or the most common tools of democracy promotion that are used, and there is not a great deal of debate over that. As we move into the middle tier, however, there's increasing amounts of debate whether or not you should be actually coercing countries to democratize. Meaning, should you be using political conditionality? Should you be using economic sanctions? However, these are tools that are very strongly supported by the governments of the northern industrialized democracies. And then it's that third tier of the interventionist spectrum, covert, paramilitary, and military intervention, well, those are always the most controversial. I mean, in essence, should we be trying to promote democracy at the points of bayonets? And the reason why I set out these various tiers of intervention is because in recent years, we have seen all of these at play, especially in the case of North Africa and the Arab Spring. And I think it warrants a discussion, especially in light of Ade's book, as to what are the preferred forms of intervention, because we also have the recent cases of Libya and Mali as well. Do I have time for one more point?
Go ahead.
All right. So then my final point, or the fourth observation, I would entitle this, and again, it draws on the subtitle of Ade's book, which I absolutely love, but that I would retitle it a little bit. The question is, are we moving from Eurafrique to Afro-Europa, or are we moving from Eurafrique to Afro-American Europa, or Afro-Chindia Europa? And the key point here, and I think this is one of the issues that is not as directly looked at in the book, is the degree to which we need to focus on the role of the other great powers in this very special relationship, meaning China, India, Russia, Japan, and then my own specialization, the United States and U.S. foreign policy towards Africa. Now, as Ade noted, I mean, there's a very interesting chapter by Ali Mazrui in the book. The title of the chapter, The Black Atlantic from Othello to Obama in Search of a Post-Racial Society, in which Ali Mazrui concludes by saying, with his election as U.S. president in November 2008, Barack Obama became the most powerful black man in the history of African civilization. Now, I mention this because although the chapter is interesting from a political theory perspective, and especially as concerns the concept of global race, it really doesn't tell us much about what we can expect in terms of U.S. foreign policy towards Africa, in terms of the EU relationship, and especially under the Obama administration. And it's especially appropriate to be talking about this today because, as you know, President Obama is going to be giving his State of the Union address tonight, the first one after being reelected to a second term of office. And I think the only thing that I would mention here in terms of Obama foreign policy, in terms of this fourth theme or this fourth observation, is that clearly everybody in this room had very high expectations for President Obama, especially as concerns U.S. foreign policy towards Africa, 4 years ago. And as we also all know, Africa, to this day, like under every U.S. administration, has always or remains last in the global hierarchy of U.S. foreign policy interests. And this is due to a wide variety of reasons. I have a paper where I set out 6 reasons why the Obama administration, like other U.S. administrations, have placed Africa last, and why this is probably not going to change much in a second Obama administration. But due to the fact that time is running short, I think the main thing that I would mention here is that when we look at the broad sweep of Obama foreign policy towards Africa, one of the interesting things for me as a specialist of foreign policy is that there has been a very heavy emphasis on national security, military-oriented programs, regional counterterrorism programs that in many respects are a continuation of what we saw under the previous Bush administration. There's a lot more that I could say about that, but I've gone over my time, so let me thank Ade and congratulate Ade again on an excellent book, and I look forward to our discussion. Thank you.
Well, first of all, Peter, thank you very much. And the comments that both of you have made about Ade's book sort of underscores that while it may be accurate to say that there's not a lot of African research on these issues, the point that you made, actually there's an enormous amount of African research coming out of the Center for Conflict Resolution. And any of you who follow all these reports and the books now, whether this gets the big picture and some European capital is another issue. I also wanted to add a very brief remark about aid, which both of you highlighted. It was your number 2 point, Peter, and you said something about it's not very controversial or some such. But actually,
relatively speaking.
Relatively speaking. But actually, no, I understand. But actually, as everybody, including everybody up here and all of you are fully aware, there's a lively debate about aid.
Yes.
And we actually had Dambisa Moyo here under Warren Hogue's leadership here, discussing her book on debt aid. I'm using another book, which includes an article by Todd Moss, who's an academic here, called Africa's Love-Hate Relationship with International Capital. In other words, private sector investment may be the way to go rather than aid with all of its conditionalities and so on. So what I'd like to do here, there's an awful lot that the three of you have put on the table, and we'll come back to you, but I'd like to invite 2 or 3 of you to make rather brief interventions, if you like, so we can keep this going. If you could identify yourself by name and your organization, and Beatrice will give you the microphone. There's a gentleman here, or Alexandra's giving you the microphone, but we have 2 microphones.
Thank you. My name is Bart Paans. I work for the European Union delegation. Thank you for the presentations made. It's very interesting. Of course, very interesting what Ms. Adebajo said about working as a Eurocrat. It sounded very exciting. Maybe I've been missing out a little bit, but it is indeed a very important and interesting project. As we speak, Lady Ashton is actually arriving here in New York because she's briefing tomorrow the Security Council on cooperation of the European Union with the UN. And my question relates to that in particular. We've heard the Consul General saying things about grand strategies, but the need to focus on practical cooperation. We've heard references to the need of an equal partnership by Mr. Schraeder. In the light of that, of course, I would be very interested to hear from you how you see that relationship evolve here in New York, as we are so close by, of course, to the UN. Because, as you can imagine, Lady Ashton will very much focus also on the African issues tomorrow in the briefing, and it's open, so I hope that many will show up to listen, obviously. And she will do that, present her views on behalf of the 27, soon to be 28 member states of the European Union, who has been referred to as following the leader. But I would like to add a little addition to that. It's more that it's a system of burden sharing we have in the EU. And in the end, the Foreign Affairs Council needs, of course, within the EU to decide on everything that Ashton is doing. But it is true that certain countries have more interest, more history, a better network in certain countries, and they're not necessarily a leader, but a burden sharer. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Would somebody else like to ask a question or make a point right now? This is your great moment. James Jonah, please.
Well, I just want to comment on the Professor Schraeder's about U.S. foreign policy. This is something which I do a regular VOA commentary, and I've touched on this. I don't think it's maybe too accurate to say that Africa has been always at a lower level. I think what happened was in the 1960s, 60 to 63, in the Congo crisis, the Congo was at the highest point in American foreign policy between the Eisenhower and the Kennedy administration. What happened then was, and this is my pain in Africa, our leaders then were very sophisticated, as you know, that they were dealing with our original leaders, the Nkrumahs, the Azikiwes, and they were able to challenge some of the interests, not only of the United States, but of Russia. And I think they came out of that experience with caution that you have to be very careful how you approach Africa. And this also happened during the Bush administration, Bush II, with AFRICOM. AFRICOM was a grand idea, but it was rejected in Nigeria and in Ghana, in many African countries, And as you know, that President Bush had to publicly declare in Ghana that America had no interest in putting a military base in Africa. I think what Obama has realized, and having studied this, is that you cannot go too quickly in Africa. Hence the hesitation in Libya, where he was accused of leading from behind. Lest he's hesitant to deal with Mubarak in Egypt, and even his reluctance in Mali. So I think that it's a kind of maturity in realizing it, and I think the New York Times, I think yesterday or Monday, published an article, or what is today, about African. They're now thinking, what do we do? So I think it's realizing that how do we play this game in Africa? So not that they don't want to deal with it, but it is becoming at times complicated. And I think what Obama said at one point is, well, let Africa deal with its own problems first, organize itself, and then we can come and join with Africa. Thank you.
Well, these are really important reflections on the themes that you've all developed here. So, Mr. Otobo, please, from the Peace Building Support Office at the UN.
Thank you very much, John. There was an issue that both Voss and Kaye referred to elliptically, and I want to probe them a bit, is the issue of the economic partnerships. And I think it was in your first point where you were talking about neocolonialism, and you made the point about whether, in fact, we have moved in a direction where we have strategic partnership. I'd be very interested in knowing your thinking about how the movement from the preferential trade arrangements that have subsisted between the EU and the African countries, how the EPA represents a movement towards an equal partnership, and if so, how can that be the case when 33 of the 50 LDCs are in Africa and they are supposed to benefit from the EBA? On the point that Schraeder made with respect to Obama administration's policy, I think I rather like the conclusion that Ambassador James Jonah has drawn, which was also my feeling, because for you to know what Obama policy was going to be to Africa, you don't need to go beyond reading his book, The Audacity of Hope. If my memory is not failing me, it's somewhere in around page 268, where he was very clear, and he articulated it very well. No, Obama said in that book, and when I finished reading that page, I knew that not much would change. He said in that book that he was going to, talking about Africa, that he was going to work with those who are ready. In fact, it was another way of saying that America, heavens will help those who help themselves. So to be surprised about the fact that there was not much change brings me to my third point. How, and that was the point that Ade raised, and I will stop there. Ade, in quoting some of the data, said that Africa accounts for 2% of the world global GDP. Now, it's going to be very difficult, other than China that is going there for the raw materials. And we're here when you moderated the session by Dabi Samoyo on her new book about China, which focuses exclusively on raw materials. And I asked her some very provocative questions. It's going to be very difficult for many of the major powers to engage in Africa or engage with Africa at a time and knowing fully well that their share of the GDP is not only not increasing, but in fact has been shrinking over time. And that's some word for thought. Thank you.
I'm going to go back to the panel. I have one more question for the panel myself, if you would, the three gentlemen, allow me. And it comes out of Peter's remark about the 7 tools and the latter tools becoming more controversial. And of course, we've all lived through the events of the French intervention in Mali of the last several weeks. And in the past, at least a number of African leaders and others were extremely critical of the French policies in Africa. And yet, at least reading the newspapers in this country, the people in Mali welcomed the French intervention very warmly. That was the presentation. I mean, perhaps there might be something else to be said. But I wonder, whether this intervention question sort of alters a little bit. That in that particular case, there seemed to have been no other alternative for the people in Timbuktu and Gao and so on. So I wonder if any of you would have any observation about the intervention and its significance for Africa. So we're going to go back to the panel. Please answer whatever questions or thoughts you're comfortable with, and time permitting, we'll have another round. Ade.
Okay, thanks very much. Really interesting comments. I think let me start with Peter's very eloquent response. I don't think that there is yet equal partnership, and I think that the Afro-Europa is something that is aspirational rather than something that has arrived. But at least the relationship has moved beyond the time when when a British Governor General notoriously described it as that of representing that of a horse and a rider. I think we're moving at least a little bit beyond that. And I think the French role is actually quite problematic, as I've said consistently. In Côte d'Ivoire, it has about 1,000 troops that are outside the UN chain of command. In Chad, Central Africa, it also intervened in a way that was very parochial. And even now in Mali, you've seen the French basically sending troops to guard the uranium mines in Niger, which gives you some sort of hint of some of the underlying parochialism or parochial interests that lie behind the intervention. But I think one also has to be pragmatic and realistic, because Africa does not yet have the capacity to be able to embark on what Ali Mazrui called the Pax Africana, to be able to take care of its own security in terms of having a fully fledged African standby force that can do the job. So as long as this is done in a multilateral way, and as long as it's handed over to a UN force, and the Africans are kind of thrown in there as cannon fodder to face these people and set up for failure, I think it will be important that we take that into account. Because what the French are doing would be like the Americans going into Afghanistan, kind of softening up the place, and it looked as if they were succeeding, and then withdrawing, and then sending in another force, and then declaring that they've failed. So we must be very careful about what we're doing here, because it's very difficult terrain in Mali, as people have pointed out, and I think the battle is only just beginning. So if France declares victory and leaves, I think it will be incredibly irresponsible, because what will follow afterwards is quite predictable. In terms of the Arab Spring, Peter, we call it the Afro-Arab Spring in my part of the world. I think that George Joffe, in his chapter, he's based at Cambridge, he wrote a wonderful chapter on the Maghreb, and it does deal with the Arab Spring, if you remember. And I think the main point that George Joffe makes basically is to speculate about the aftermath of this intervention and to criticize what he sees as the EU's misguided policy that supported autocrats as bulwarks against political Islam, basically, rather than supporting more grassroots movements and the yearnings of the youth in the Arab world. That's what I remember from the book as far as the Arab Spring is concerned. In terms of Obama, I think Obama, like Clinton, you're going to see at some point, probably in his third year, he will suddenly start embarking on African safaris and feeling the continent's pain. And, you know, I don't really know whether photo opportunities is what we need from Obama. I think what we really should be focusing on in terms of Obama is this homicidal policy of sending drones, not only to Afghanistan and Pakistan, but in the African context, in Somalia, in Mali now, and they're planning more drone strikes in Libya and Nigeria. And I think at least the debate has started now in this country on drones, but I think that is one of the most dangerous aspects of the Obama administration that deserves a lot more attention. And the op-ed that was written on Thursday in the New York Times that pointed out the inconsistencies and the illogicalities of trying to justify this under international law when 3,500 largely innocent people have died as a result of this kill list is something that we should all be thinking and talking about. So I don't really understand the silence of liberals who would be jumping up and down if it was Bush that was doing this. So I think we really need to focus on, the kind of, it is a securitization of African policy in the way that Bush securitized Africa policy as well. So there's no difference. It's a different driver, but the same car, basically. Dambisa Moyo, I'm tempted to respond to her, but I think the less said about her, the better. In terms of the EU-UN relationship, I think that the EU security role is, how do I describe it? The EU has intervened in the DRC in 2003 and 2006, and also intervened in Chad, Central African Republic. But much of this looks like what Peter was saying, where France is basically trying to multilateralize what was a discredited unilateral policy. And it also looks like the EU is trying to look for places to test out its evolving security policies. So it's been disjointed. It hasn't always been where the needs are. I remember the EU turning down a request from the UN Secretary General to try to support the UN mission in the DRC. And I think it's worth noting also that the two main military powers in the EU, France and Britain, who also happen to be two veto-wielding members of the UN Security Council that should no longer be on it, just based on the fact that they're no longer great powers. It's quite reckless and irresponsible, in my view, that they act often outside of the UN chain of command. So you had France acting outside the UN chain of command in Côte d'Ivoire, now in Mali. You had the British doing the same in Sierra Leone. I think I would expect two permanent members of the Security Council to be strengthening UN peacekeeping rather than weakening it. And I certainly do not see the EU as any sort of alternative to UN peacekeeping, because I think it enjoys even less legitimacy than the UN. But I think where the EU could help is to provide rapid reaction forces in the way that it did in Bunia in 2003 until the UN could take over. And I think that could be more positive. But certainly the Chad Central African Republic was a charade by France to basically protect two autocrats. The main argument in terms of Otobo's question with this economic partnership agreements, my understanding of it is that the WTO rules no longer allow those preferential arrangements. That's the argument that the EU makes. And so they have to move away from the arrangements that existed then. And the African argument is that they're being forced to open up their markets in an unequal way in very sensitive sectors like procurement and others, while they're being denied full access to the EU market. The assistance they were receiving is declining, and the common agricultural policy continues to do tremendous damage in the sector in which most Africans actually enjoy employment. That's my own understanding of the main argument. And finally, to John Hirsch's point, the people in Mali were celebrating, but the Iraqis and Afghans also were celebrating when the US first arrived, so beware.
Terrific. Thank you very much, Ade. Everybody's taking it all in, I hope. There's a lot happening up here. Peter.
3 points on UN and Europe. I hope it will be about international public goods, where the UN is taking the lead, And Europe has a lot to offer. And when I look to the new budget of the Netherlands for development cooperation, probably half of the money will be spent on combating climate change. And then there's a large part reserved for public health. And these are the, let's say, the strong element of the UN machinery. But again, I think Europe can make contributions here. EPAs. Well, one of the success stories of Europe is, of course, the internal market. We have been moving away our barriers to trade and growth, and there's an enormous amount of work still to be done in Africa. Physically, I mean, even roads, European Investment Bank and Europe, I mean, the Development Fund is investing a lot in roads, but what you don't know is that these contracts very often go to Chinese contractors. So more and more in Brussels this is being discussed because it gives China an enormous image boom, but the money is coming from Brussels. Anyway, I have the feeling that in this removal of barriers to growth and trade, a lot has to be done, and there's real added value of Europe. I'm not so sure if Brussels, EU has added value on security issues. Of course, we all know that. I mean, there are two countries, the UK and France, who have the machinery, the logistics, and the parliament and the populations to help when it's necessary. And it was absolutely necessary in Mali. We lived, when was it, 15, 20 years ago in Mali, when 200 Tuareg fighters being sent back by Colonel Gaddafi back to their homes started a civil war in Mali, which is an absolutely peaceful area. But they didn't want to be involved in salt mining or in showing around tourists, so they started killing the local tribes. And there was a civil war. And it was solved then. Easily? No. But with courage, with imagination, with the help of Nigerian African peace forces. But now the situation is even worse. There are other players in the Sahel region. And it's so simple, with a couple of thousand people, to destabilize that region from Mauritania to Darfur in Sudan. And interesting, when I asked my ambassador in Mali about his vision on this, he said what I found amazing was the speech made by the French president, François Hollande, when he went to Tombouctou, and he said to the Malian population, this is what we give back, because your people, 100,000 Malian soldiers, have fought in the Second World War. Now we come and pay back our duty. Psychology of aid. Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. And it's Rob, not Peter, I know. I misspoke, and I apologize. But now, Peter.
All right. I mean, my response is very briefly, I mean, I agree with Ade about the case of Mali, which is, fascinating. We see other cases where after the initial arrival of troops and stability, there's people that are very happy, but then what happens in the long term? And of course, we've received reports in the last 48 hours of French troops being attacked by forces that are regrouping. What strikes me most about the Mali case, though, is the degree to which, to go back to John's question, is how unique is it? And for me, what's interesting, it's unique in the sense that I wonder, had the government of Gaddafi not been overthrown and you'd had 2,500 to 3,000 Tuareg go back to that territory, whether or not you would have seen the overthrow of the Malian government. So was this a unique event because you have just an overflow or, an overflow of a problem across a border? One aspect that is new, or that is increasingly new, is the growing cooperation between France and Britain in terms of their military policies in Mali, to use the term that used burden sharing. So the Brits have supplied, 350 troops and air refueling and all sorts of things. So there's much greater cooperation, which is a very interesting development. But then in some aspects, in some ways, it's very typical of what we've seen when we think about intervention on the African continent, meaning in the case of the United States and the international community in general, there were calls for action many months ago before it reached the crisis stage. And it was only when it reached the crisis stage that people actually reacted. And the classic American approach, if there was a European partner willing to take the lead, the U.S. would support that European partner. And even in that case, there was great debate in the Obama administration over the degree to which the administration could provide even air refueling capabilities, because maybe that would get the U.S. too involved in another conflict with a heavy Islamic element. So that would be one point. The point about follow the leader and burden sharing, I agree with you 100%. I think it depends on, however, what areas of policy we're talking about. And I guess for me personally, when I look especially at more of the military interventions, that's where you have more of the follow the leader effect, because you have one country like France willing to take the lead. When it comes to Obama foreign policy towards Africa, so I appreciate the comments of our two African colleagues. For me personally, so we talk about liberals, so as a liberal, when I saw, very strong liberal, when we voted for Obama, and I must say I voted for Hillary Clinton. I wanted Hillary as president in the primaries. Full disclosure.
2016 is coming.
But when we look at Obama's past, Democratic president, books on Africa, African heritage, first American president who had actually traveled to Africa not once but twice prior to becoming president. So he went there for 5 weeks to visit his father. He then went as a U.S. Senator, where he visited 5 African countries. So if there was somebody who we thought, as an Africanist, as Africanists in the discipline, that would pursue a much more proactive policy that would be more connected to his own personal vision of the world. And as we've seen, there have been tremendous constraints. I mean, first and foremost, the U.S. economy. If he wanted to be reelected, you've got to focus on the economy. Otherwise, you're not going to be reelected. And then in the international sphere, it was Europe, Russia, Middle East, a lot of proactive initiatives in the Middle East. But we saw almost nothing related to Africa for a wide variety of reasons. And I think that the most disappointing thing, especially for liberals, is that what this meant was a continuation of, you could call it the militarization of policy, or as Ade noted, the securitization of policy, where we saw a continuation of inherited policies from the Bush administration. So you have a sense of bureaucratic incrementalism. Things just stay the same because the president is not inserting the role of the White House to necessarily change things. But I think also is that Obama is not quite as liberal as people expected when he was initially elected into office. I mean, this is a man who, in his administration, starting out in 2009, had one of the most heavily populated administrations by former military personnel, including in the White House. If you go through the list of his initial group, like Jonathan Scott Gratian, Mark Lippert, who was a Navy SEAL, James Jones, a career military officer, what you had people around Obama that were very heavily in the security sector. So hence it shouldn't have really come as any surprise that the regional counterterrorism initiatives continued, and IMET continued, and AFRICOM continued. But I think that many of us had hoped that there would be a greater or stronger focus on development, which wasn't necessarily the case.
My own personal theory is what I call the automatic pilot theory of United States foreign policy, which is until a crisis and you crash, it more or less goes on. You can all mull that over. It applies in many areas. I'm sure you could think about it. We have time for one or two more questions if anybody has anything more they'd like. So let's take two more here.
I'm just able to do a follow-up because there are really serious.
Hang on, please. Could you hang on a second? Just hang on. So we'll come back to you in just a second. But let's have this gentleman and then Francesco, and then you can make your last point, and then we'll have the wrap up by the panel. So you'll have one more chance to go around here. Please, could you identify yourself?
Yeah, thank you, William Awinado Kanjirige Ghana Mission. I came a little late and I wanted to just listen, but hearing my good friend Adebajo sufficiently provoking me to speak, I wish to make a few comments. The first is to say that I think in Africa we are seeing more and more of not rickety bicycles, but relatively new bicycles of an expanded middle class, an proactive civil society, an engaging diaspora, and governance mechanisms that are being renewed and so on and so forth. So the cup is half full and not half empty. Having said that, I want to quickly also link to the comment of my brother about the EPAs, because I think that anyone who thinks that they can sit in Asia or Europe or America and ride a horse of an Africa must be moving against history and civilization. EPA, a couple of years ago, European Commission was putting such extreme pressure on ECOWAS to go ahead and sign. And our negotiators were able to stand the ground. And when they stood the ground, the Commission went above them to the heads of states, the politicians, to instruct them. The issue about riding the horse was changing. I was at a meeting with a European minister who was saying exactly the same thing why we were dragging our feet. And to my relief, because I couldn't respond, a civil society rep responded on behalf of Africa, that you have told us that we should democratize. Our people are saying that we are not ready, and we are telling our politicians that this is the way to go. So let's go it full circle. That is why I'm very optimistic about what is happening in Africa, and that the key is that not the politicians, but civil society in Africa and elsewhere in the world are linking up and showing the way. And it is being translated into UN action, and that is where to go. Not so much the politicians or what a foreign policy from elsewhere may come from. The real pressure is coming. Thank you.
Francesco Mancini, our Director of Research.
Hi, Ade. Welcome back also on my behalf. I was wondering, a question for you, what kind of forces are now playing on Africa unity? In your book, you see the role of the Cold War actually in some way freezing the movement toward coming together, while, for example, in Western Europe was pulling the countries together. I was wondering what kind of forces are at work right now, also external forces, is the rise of Asia, is investment from China, all these forces in some way playing toward pulling Africa countries together or keep them apart. Here in the UN there is still a perception that at least some African countries read sovereignty in a rather traditional way. The big delegation of sovereignty that happened in Europe, not really happening in Africa yet. Although the African Union Charter is quite advanced from that point of view. What forces are at play? Is Africa coming together, being pulling apart?
You have a brief remark? Just very, very brief, please.
Very brief indeed, but wait for the microphone.
Yeah, thank you. No, I wanted to make the point, and this is addressed to Mr. DeVos. He did not explain in his response to my question, how is it that you can call what is happening part of strategic partnership when through the EPAs, the EU is trying to force on Africa issues of procurement, competition policy, and investment that have been rejected in the context of the WTO. And secondly, at the same time that the EU is saying that those preferences can no longer be available to Africa, they are being given to Moldova, and the Western Balkan countries. Thank you.
So we got about 2 minutes to wrap this up. We're going to go in reverse order, if we may. So, Peter, do you have any further remarks you'd like to offer? I'm going to let Ade have the last word.
Definitely. I mean, very quickly, to go back to the comment by the research director in the back, what I find and what I'm doing in terms of a current book that I'm writing, I reverse what you are asking, and I ask the question, is it actually beneficial for Africa that you have other rising great powers within the international system so that there is greater competition between the EU, the US, China, India, such that for African countries that are democratizing, are they able to play these powers off of each other to get the best deals for their countries? And what my research shows is that that is the case for countries in the process of democratization or that have democratized, but it's not the case for dictatorships, which typically maintain their special relationships with the former colonial power. So I'd end on that note.
Mr. DeVos.
I can't answer that question technically on EPAs because I'm not an expert on this, but competition policies and investment policies I do believe are essential for a level playing field and investment climates and should be part of that agreement. Maybe two last remarks. One is that we have been talking a lot about state-to-state relationships, but more and more important, I think, is what's going on in what is called the network societies, the networks, also because of our fantastic possibilities of technology. So I think there's a great future for Africa. If you look at the massive online open courses, I mean, there's an explosion of students using these facilities, and especially, I think, for Africa, this could be a way out. Finally, one of my last visits in Southern Africa, I was standing on the 3rd or 4th floor of a big building with a huge German ambassador, and we were looking outside. And there was this tiny, and maybe if you've been in Windhoek, church, and more, this church is fading away because there's a new Supreme Court built by the Koreans, and there's another building, a museum from the former president built by the Chinese. And I said to him, isn't this a metaphor of the end of European influence in Africa? And he gave it a thought, and then he said, no. It's not about stones. He said it's about those thousands and thousands of people coming every year, going to remote corners of the country and take an interest in culture and starts to love Namibia. That's far more important than all these stones. Thank you.
Ade.
Thank you. William, I thought you would start by congratulating the Super Eagles, but I want to offer condolences to the Black Stars, as you know, I always will. But very good to see you. I didn't mean to come across as so pessimistic, William. I was just trying to focus more on the comparison between the AU and EU, but all of the things you're saying in terms of the growing middle class in Africa, the fact that Africans have more cell phones than even in the US and Europe and elsewhere, those are all good things as long as we can build on them. But the way the year has ended and started last year and this year with DRC, Central African Republic and Mali, does give one cause for pause, let's say. I think in terms of the other question from Francesco there, I mean, China and other external powers, etc., are an opportunity for Africa, as Peter was saying, but it's an opportunity that Africans have to develop a vision and strategy to take advantage of. So China is creating special economic zones, it's investing heavily, it's building infrastructure. But if the Africans don't have a vision to define how all of this works, it will be like the old colonialism where you're building railways that go to the port to take out raw materials, and it's not really going to be value added. So I think it depends very much on how we engage with it. And there are forums like FOCAC, which just took place. There's the Tokyo Initiative, which is taking place again. It's every 5 years, which I think we need to take advantage of. But a new Pan-Africanism would have to be defined on the basis of economic decolonization and economic integration. So we've fought the battle for political decolonization, but we're the only region in the world where trade is 10% or less. So that has to be the place that we focus, but I don't really see much of a vision or strategy, to be quite honest. And a final comment, John, if I may, I just want to take a jibe at the EU. It's quite significant, I think, that the EU got the Nobel Prize for Peace, not economics.
Well, it would be unbelievable and unrealistic for me to end this by just saying everything's going to be all right. However, I always come away from these events, and particularly today with the three of you and the audience, encouraged. And I really mean that. And it's the interest in Africa and the point you made just 1 minute ago about personal engagement that I think really does make the difference. I mean, whether it's US, China, India, or the EU, I mean, one can debate these things indefinitely. But the engagement is there. And so on behalf of all the people in this audience, I really want to thank the three of you, for the book, which I think is absolutely superb, and for your participation today. So thank you all very much. Let's give them all a big hand.